I remember the way she stood there, like the wind hadn't earned the right to move her. The morning she arrived, the Colorado sky was the color of ash, and the train was already halfway down the canyon before the sound of it faded. All that was left behind was dust and old trunk with worn leather corners. And her. She didn't cry, didn't ask for help, just stood there on the wooden platform like she'd been carved out of silence itself. Her coat was gray wool heavy for early fall. Her face was half shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat. And though I'd spent 30 years in Ash Bluff, I'd never seen anyone look more like they didn't belong and more like they'd already claimed the land beneath their boots. Her name was Clara Wynn, the mail-order bride to a man already 6 feet under by the time she arrived. James Wynn was no outlaw, just a hopeful soul with bad timing, gunned down outside the livery in a dispute no one cared to explain. Shot 2 weeks before Clara's train left St. Louis. Folks had written. Letters had gone unanswered. But still, she came. Didn't speak a word on the ride to his homestead, just nodded when I pointed out the orchard. James had started the barn leaning to one side the porch that still creaked when the wind blew east. She looked at it all, like a woman trying to remember a place she'd never seen. And I didn't say much either. Because some silences, you don't fill. You just witness them. And somehow, honor the weight they carry. I didn't know her story yet, but I knew this. She hadn't come west to mourn. She'd come to finish something. And I reckon it was only just beginning. She didn't unpack right away. Clara Wynn stepped down from the wagon like she'd crossed an ocean, not just a prairie. Her boots hit the ground with a quiet crunch, and she stood there a moment still, and upright eyes fixed on the house James had written about in every one of his letters. It wasn't much, just a modest clapboard house with a porch that looked east, a slanted barn beside it, and a fence that leaned more than it stood. But James had called it a place to begin again, and now it was hers, alone. "I'll leave you to it," I told her, thumb hooked behind my belt. She didn't answer, just nodded. I rode off, slow dust rising behind me, like a curtain being drawn. From the road, I glanced back once. She was still standing there, still staring at the front door, like it might open if she just waited long enough. The house held its breath just like she did. Inside it was neat, spare. A single chair, a small table, a shirt freshly folded still laying where James must have left it weeks before that bullet met his chest outside the livery. There was a pair of boots by the door, and on the table a journal. Open. The ink dried mid-word. Clara didn't touch anything for hours. She just stood there, hands at her sides, taking it in, like you take in a grave, slow, careful, unwilling to turn away. That night, she didn't light the fire. Instead, she wrapped a wool blanket around her shoulders and sat on the porch in the dark. The stars came out, one by one, blooming like frost flowers across a black sky. Somewhere far off, a coyote called into the cold air, and the wind answered in that low, ghost-sounding hush it always does when the land remembers something you've forgotten. She didn't flinch, didn't cry. She just listened, and I reckon the land listened back. In the days that followed, Clara began moving through that house like a woman cleaning out sorrow. She swept the floor with slow, methodical strokes. She scrubbed the kitchen table until the wood drank in the lye. She found a broken stool and repaired it, binding the cracked leg with twine and wax. But she still didn't speak. Not to me. Not to the women from the church who left bread at the gate. Not even to the blacksmith's boy who brought her a jug of kerosene. Ash Bluff is a small town, and small towns don't take kindly to mysteries. They want their grief worn proper with black veils and wet handkerchiefs and weeping at the right places. But Clara, she wore silence like armor. Not cold, not cruel, just unwilling to explain herself to a world that had already taken too much. I remember watching her from my saddle one morning, just past dawn. She walked behind the barn, hair tied back in a simple knot, her boots damp with dew. There in a rough patch of ground were 3 young apple trees James had planted the spring before. 2 of them were dying, thin, brittle, leaning sideways, like they were trying to run from the wind. But one still stood straight, its branches bare but stubborn. She stood in front of that tree for a long time. Then real quiet, real soft, she reached out and put her hand on the bark. And she said, "Grow." Just one word, a whisper really. But it was the first thing I'd heard her say since the train brought her here. And I swear to God the tree stood taller the next morning. Word got around. About the widow who never said a word. About the porch light that never came on. About the soft clink of hammer on nail when the wind was up. Some pitied her, some feared her. A few called her mad. One old gal at the general store said she must be cursed. God took her husband and her tongue in one go. But I think the church women understood. They'd buried sons, you see. They'd lost with grace and buried with dignity. And they knew sometimes silence ain't weakness. It's faith or defiance or something that ain't got a name but still holds. As for me, I just kept riding past every few days. Never stopped. Never intruded. Just made sure the gate stayed closed, the chimney stayed clear, the fences didn't fall down in the wind. And every now and then, when the sky got that deep blue before snowfall and the prairie smelled like firewood and frost, I'd hear a chair scrape on the porch, and I'd look over my shoulder, and I'd see her sitting there still wrapped in that old gray blanket, staring out toward a horizon she hadn't chosen, but had claimed anyway. And I knew then she hadn't come to disappear. She'd come to build something quiet, and maybe even to become something new. And in a town full of noise, that kind of silence can make a man stop and listen. There's a kind of hush that settles on a place before something important happens. Not the kind that falls when folks are sleeping or when a storm rolls in. No, this was different. This was the silence of something beginning to shift, like the sound the earth makes before it splits open and gives birth to spring. And Clara Wynne, she was right in the middle of it. By the third week, most in Ash Bluff had picked their side. Some thought she was strange. Others said she was grieving wrong. A few even whispered her silence was a judgment, like she was holding a mirror up to the rest of us, and we didn't like what we saw. But me, I saw something else entirely. See, I'd been around long enough to know the difference between someone who's hiding and someone who's choosing not to be seen. It was the sixth day without mail when I spotted her walking into town. She wore a plain brown dress, sleeves rolled to the elbows, no hat this time. Beneath one arm, she carried a bundle wrapped in cloth, tightly tied and purposeful. In the other, a folded slip of paper worn at the edges, like it had been opened and closed too many times. She didn't stop at the saloon, didn't glance at the chapel, went straight to the general store. I followed from a respectful distance. Inside, I watched her hand that slip of paper to young Eli behind the counter. He read it, blinked, then looked up confused. "You need all this?" he asked, voice cracking slightly. She didn't answer, just nodded once, slow and certain. It was a list, handwritten in clean cursive, things like dried comfrey leaves, ginger root, willow bark, old remedies, things most folks only hear about from grandmothers or midwives, too stubborn to leave this world. Then the door creaked open behind her, and in walked Trouble. Clayton Burr, part-time rancher, full-time drunk. Big man with bigger opinions. He reeked of whiskey and stale cigar smoke, and he squinted at Clara like she was a riddle he didn't want to solve. "Well, look what the prairie coughed up," he said, voice loud enough to rattle the jars on the shelf. "Widow Wynne herself. You got a voice under all that wool, or just think you're too fine to speak to the rest of us." The room tensed. Eli stepped back uncertain. I didn't move. Clara didn't either. She just stood there back, straight eyes steady, not a flicker of fear or annoyance. Her silence cut deeper than 1,000 words ever could. "You know," Burr went on, leaning in some, say, a quiet woman's hiding something. "Could be, you're not mourning your man at all. Could be, you helped him along to the grave. That did it." I don't remember crossing the room. One second I was leaning against the wall. The next my hand was clamped down on Burr's shoulder, squeezing just enough to remind him who still wore the badge in Ash Bluff. "You finish your shopping," I said low, "and move along." He stared at me, eyes wide, then at Clara, who hadn't even blinked. With a grunt and a mock tip of his hat, he turned and stormed out. The room warmed the moment he was gone. I looked at her, then truly looked. She wasn't shaken, wasn't angry. She just lifted the cloth-wrapped bundle, set it on the counter, and waited. Eli cleared his throat. Medicinal, she nodded. For what, he asked softly. No answer. But then she reached into her coat and pulled out a torn page from what looked like an old medical almanac. On it were hand-drawn diagrams, notes in pencil, and treatments listed in careful handwriting. Burn salves, teas for fever poultices, for infection. "You planning to open a clinic?" I asked, more out of curiosity than suspicion. She met my eyes. Then for the first time she picked up a pencil from the counter, turned the paper over and wrote, "I help where I can, that's all." I read it, then read it again. That was enough. 2 days later the fire came. It started at the saloon. No one knew how. Some blamed a tipped lantern, others said Burr's boys had gotten careless again. By the time I reached Main Street, half the West Row was already lit up like the gates of hell. Flames licked at window panes. Smoke churned thick and choking. People screamed, tossed buckets, formed shaky lines. We were losing ground fast. And then out of the haze she came. No shawl, no gloves. Just Clara wind sleeves, rolled high hair, damp with sweat, a bucket in each hand. She didn't yell, didn't break stride, just moved. Calm, efficient, fierce. She handed out water, pressed cloth to scorch skin, wrapped wounds with bandages she'd clearly prepared days before. When a child was pulled from the wreckage of the saloon porch, his leg mangled and bleeding, Clara dropped to her knees beside him without hesitation. His mother sobbed, Is he gonna make it? Clara didn't answer. She just worked crushed herbs in her palm, pressed them to the wound, wrapped tight with linen. All business, all grace, all fight. That night, long after the fire was out, I found her sitting alone on the church steps, hands, raw face streaked with soot. She didn't look up as I sat beside her. After a while, she pulled out that same pencil and paper, wrote 5 words. Sometimes you don't need words. I looked at her and I nodded. Yeah, I said quietly, I hear you just fine. And from that night on, so did the rest of the town. They came quiet like guilt on Sunday. 3 of them at first, riders dressed in dust and old leather with rifles slung across their backs and mouths set tight like men who've said their piece long ago. One wore a red kerchief over his face. Another had a scar curling from his jaw to his ear. The third just looked tired in a way that doesn't come from age but from remembering too much. I saw them before Clara did. They tied their horses outside the saloon, didn't order a drink, didn't laugh, didn't spit. Just asked around in low voices about the Wind place, about the orchard, about a woman who spoke with her hands instead of her tongue. Ash Bluff may be small, but whispers travel faster than fire. By sundown, I knew what was coming, and so did Clara. I rode to her place before dusk. The air held that thick stillness that settles right before a storm rolls in, not just in the sky, but in the blood. She was on the porch, sleeves rolled, hair braided back, sitting with a rifle across her knees like it was part of her. Visitors are coming, I said, dismounting. She didn't look surprised, just nodded once and motioned for me to sit. For a moment we said nothing, just listened to the wind brushing through the brittle grass, the creak of the barn door, the long breath of the land itself. Then she spoke, quiet, measured, almost like a question to the horizon. They say James took land that wasn't his. I glanced at her. He bought it, signed papers at the fort. She nodded again. But war don't always leave clean lines, does it? No, I said, it don't. The man with the scar showed up first. Didn't ride up close. Just stopped at the edge of the orchard and stared. I stood. Clara didn't. She stayed seated still, that rifle resting like patience across her lap. You Winds girl, the man asked. She nodded. He spat into the dirt. Figured, you got his mouth. She answered flat. I've got more than that. His eyes flicked to the rifle. He smiled without humor. I ain't here for blood, lady. Just wanted to see what's left of the man who took my brother's land while he was bleeding out in a tent outside Vicksburg. Clara stood now, slow, deliberate. Your brother sold this land, signed it over in front of a notary. Under duress, the man growled, with a bullet still in his gut and morphine in his veins. That patch of dirt used to be ours. And now? He looked around at the barn, the trees, the porch. Now it's yours. She didn't blink, not for long. He chuckled. Best be gone before sundown, widow. It ain't just me this time. Then he turned, mounted, and rode back down the trail, disappearing into the orange smear of dusk. Inside the house, Clara locked the doors. Without a word, she reached into the cabinet and pulled out a second rifle, loaded it herself, movements sure and calm. She opened the stove and placed James's last letter inside. Watched it burn. When I asked why, she said only, no more reading the past, only preparing for what's coming. They returned at twilight. 6 riders, bandanas, shadowed faces, horses slick with sweat and dust. Their shapes emerged from the low hills like phantoms called by old grudges. The wind had picked up by then, rattling the orchard, slapping shutters, dragging clouds across the sky, like bruises across skin. Clara stood on the porch, not in a dress, not wrapped in lace, but in canvas and leather, her long coat flapping against her boots. Her pistol hung low on her right side, the rifle still cradled across her chest. I was beside her. I'd called in 2 old vets from town, quiet men, sober and sharp-eyed. They were in the barn, rifles ready. They'll want blood, I murmured. She didn't look at me, just stared ahead and said, I'm done bleeding. The first shot didn't come from us. It cracked from the barn, one clean warning shot straight into the air. It echoed like a ghost remembering something ugly. Still, they rode forward, desperate, proud, and too far down the road of vengeance to turn back. The scarred man raised his rifle. Clara fired first. He hit the dirt hard, didn't move. Then the gunfire roared like thunder. We moved together, me to the left, Clara steady on the steps. She dropped another man trying to flank through the trees. The barn lit up. One rider screamed. Another fell sideways, tangled in his reins. When it ended, 3 lay dead. 1 wounded. 2 rode off into the wind, their hate trailing behind them like smoke. Clara stood motionless, eyes locked on the hills. Then slow, she sat down again right there on the steps as the wind calmed and the sky turned purple with dusk. She closed her eyes and prayed. Not for vengeance, not even for forgiveness, but for peace. The next morning, the town was quiet. Folks whispered about what happened. Some called it justice, some called it a warning. But everyone agreed on one thing. The woman who came west in silence had finally spoken, and she'd done it without saying a word. And me, I looked at that battered orchard, the scars on her hands, the quiet in her face, and I understood. She hadn't just defended her land. She'd claimed her place in it, rooted, unmoving, unafraid. There's a kind of silence that only comes after violence. Not the kind that soothes, but the kind that lingers like smoke in a shirt you can't wash out. That's what Ash Bluff felt like the morning after the shootout. The sky was washed in a cold blue haze, and frost clung to the porch rails like fingers that hadn't quite let go. The blood had been shoveled off the dirt, the bodies carted away before sunup, but the memory of it, of her, still clung to the town like pine tar. Clara Wynne didn't come into town that day. She didn't need to. Ash Bluff came to her. By midweek, I watched a quiet procession unfold at her homestead. The preacher's wife left a pot of stew on the steps. Old Miss Gentry dropped off bolts of canvas and a few jars of pickled eggs. Even Eli from the general store came riding out, boots too big and nervous energy in every step, just to say, "Ma'am, if you ever need help with anything." She didn't answer. Just nodded once, that same soft nod that had come to mean more than a dozen words from anyone else. For a woman who'd spoken fewer than 50 words since she stepped off that train, Clara Wynne now held the entire town's attention. And yet she remained unchanged. She replanted what the riders had trampled, rehung the lanterns that had been shot loose, boiled her linen bandages again, and lined them in neat rows inside a cedar box James had built the first week he arrived. Some nights I'd catch the scent of her fire blowing across the ridge, and I'd picture her sitting at that table, calloused hands steeping herbs, the pistol still within reach, her eyes always on the door. Not afraid, not waiting, just be ready. About a week later, I rode out with a wagon full of salvaged lumber. When I arrived, she was already outside, arms crossed, brow raised at the rotted wall of the barn that had caught stray bullets during the shootout. "You need a barn wall," I said simply, nodding toward the sagging frame. She didn't reply, just glanced toward the yard where a box of tools lay open, neat, clean, ready. "You were going to do it yourself," I said, more surprised than I should have been. She tilted her head slightly. That look again, half amusement, half quiet challenge. I scratched the back of my neck. "Well, I brought a hammer anyway." We worked side by side that afternoon. The sun never came out fully, just hovered behind a screen of gray like it was watching us work. She didn't say a word, but her rhythm was steady. Every nail struck clean, every board placed with care. Around mid-afternoon, she handed me a steaming mug. I took a sip, winced. "Tastes like regret," I said, trying to lighten the moment. She shot me a look. "Kidding," I muttered. "It's strong." She didn't smile. Not quite. But her mouth twitched just enough for me to feel it in my chest, like a fire I didn't know I'd been missing. By sundown, the new wall stood straight, proud, like it had never known rot. I leaned against it, flexing my shoulder. "You're not just surviving out here," I said, voice soft. "You're building something." Clara stood beside me, arms folded, looking out across the plains. "You ever think about leaving?" I asked. She stared out at the horizon. The prairie was gold dust fading into blue mountains rising like ghost spines beyond the haze. Her voice came low. "This land, it listens." It was the first thing she'd said in over a week. I blinked. "You speak," I said, not hiding the awe in my voice. She shrugged lightly as if it didn't matter. But it did. To me, it did. We sat together on the porch bench as the wind rolled in soft. Our shoulders brushed once. Neither of us moved. It wasn't a love story, not yet, maybe not ever. It was something quieter, something steadier, like roots. The first snow came 2 nights later, slow, deliberate flakes falling like secrets the sky couldn't keep anymore. I stopped by before dawn, hat in hand, boots crusted in frost. She was already awake barefoot on the porch, breath curling like smoke in the cold. "I got a letter," I said, stepping inside when she opened the door. She poured coffee, sat across from me. "Fort Laramie wants me back," I said. "More marshals. Trouble coming up from the South Raiders may be worse." She didn't blink, just waited. "I'm not going," I added quickly. "Not yet. This town, it needs someone, and I hesitated. You make it hard to leave." She watched me a long time. No warmth, no distance, just clarity. "I don't know what I am to you," I said, "and I don't need to. But I'd rather ride into a storm with you beside me than wait for another letter from a man who left alone." Still, she didn't speak, but she reached for something James's letter, the last one, folded it slowly, set it aside. Then softly, clear and quiet, she said, "Don't write alone." I swallowed hard. "Is that a promise?" I asked. She didn't answer with words, just gave me the barest nod. And somehow, in that tiny motion, the world shifted. It was never about what she lost. It was about what she chose to keep and what she was willing to build even after the fire. You can tell a storm's coming long before the sky says so. It's in the way the birds disappear, the way the wind holds its breath, the way a town gets quieter than it should ever be. Ash Bluff was breathing like that the day they came. It started with a riderless horse. Spooked and lathered, it wandered in from the south trail saddle, twisted one stirrup torn clean off. Dried blood caked the horn. Sheriff's instinct in me kicked quick. I checked the brand. The horse belonged to a postal runner from Northridge Mine, a kid named Bramley with eyes too big for his boots. He didn't make it home. By noon, I was hearing whispers. A wagon train had vanished north of the draw. Dynamite was stolen. A boy found a bloodied belt in the riverbed and ran all the way back to town to hand it to the preacher like it was a sermon. At the saloon, someone found a note. It was pinned to the swinging doors with the same kind of knife used by raiders during the border wars. The handwriting was jagged, shaking. "The widow ain't the only one who's lost something. We're coming, and we're taking it all back." I didn't show Clara the note that night. Didn't need to. I knocked on her door just after sunset. She opened it without a word, eyes calm, hair-braided sleeves rolled. She already knew. She always did. "Lock the doors," I said. "Keep the fire low." She nodded. Then, without asking a single question, she walked across the room, lifted the second rifle from the wall, and began checking the rounds. Her hands didn't shake. She didn't blink. She loaded the weapon like she'd been born for it. And maybe in a way, she had. They came at twilight. Not just 3 or 4. 6 riders mounted hard, their bandanas soaked in sweat and powder. They didn't creep. They didn't announce. They charged fast and crooked like lightning tearing through dry hills. But Clara was ready. So was I. So were the 3 townsmen I'd posted in the barn, men with old scars and steady fingers. We weren't soldiers anymore, but we remembered. The orchard stood between us and the road. Bare branches tangled against the bruising sky, shaking in the wind. Clara stepped forward, her rifle slung, her pistol low on the hip. She wasn't in morning clothes, no lace, no gray shawl. She wore canvas, dusty boots, and the look of a woman who had nothing left to prove, only something left to protect. I stood to her right. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. "They'll want blood," I whispered. She answered clear as glass, "I'm done bleeding." The first shot rang out from the barn, not a kill. A warning. One round into the sky, echoing like a memory no one wanted to remember. The gang kept coming. They split formation. 1 to the left, 2 through the trees, 1 cutting across the fence line. I recognized the man with the scar from before, eyes crazed now, riding straight through the orchard. Clara fired first, dropped him clean. He didn't even scream. I moved to flank, my old limp, forgotten like the land itself had lent me its bones for the night. Every shot I took counted, every one of hers too. A rider went down near the barn, another near the trough. The last one tried to turn back, but Eli of all people was waiting by the livery with a borrowed Winchester in shaky hands. He didn't miss, and then it was quiet. Ash Bluff held its breath once again. Smoke drifted low, curling around the fences. No one moved, no one cheered. Because it hadn't been a victory, not really. It was a reckoning. Clara stood on the porch, hair loose, now her coat torn where a bullet had passed too close. She didn't lower her rifle right away, not even when the last rider had fled. Instead, she sat slow, deliberate on the same step where she'd once watched the stars and said nothing. And there, with blood still drying in the dirt and the wind whispering through broken branches, she prayed. Not for justice, not for salvation. She prayed for peace, for a kind of quiet that doesn't come from silence, but from endings. By morning, word had spread faster than the frost. They talked about how Clara Wynne held the line with a look, a bullet, and a will forged harder than steel. How the widow who once wouldn't speak had written a defense of the town in gunfire and grit. No one asked for her thanks. No one gave her pity. What they gave was respect. That week, I offered her a badge. She laughed in my face, not cruel, not mocking, just tired. I don't need a badge, she said. I've got roots. And she did. The kind you don't dig up. The kind you build towns around. The kind that keep growing even after the wind stops howling. And that night when I passed her porch on my way home, I saw her silhouette in the window, rocking slow, rifle resting against the wall, a candle flickering low beside her tea. She hadn't said much, but the land had heard her just fine. The first snow fell quiet that year, soft as breath, slow as forgiveness. It blanketed the fields without sound, clung to the old fence rails like time finally taking a seat. Ash Bluff woke that morning to white roofs and hushed voices. Even the dogs barked softer, as if the land itself had chosen stillness. At Clara's place, the chimney smoked early. A new fence post stood where the old one had split during the shootout. The orchard held fast beneath the snow branches, bare, but standing like bones that had learned how to bear the cold. She stepped onto the porch just before sunrise. Same coat, same boots, a mug in her hand steaming with something strong and herbal. I was already riding past, and for the first time, she waved. Not much, just a raise of the hand. But after all, we'd seen all she'd endured. That single motion said more than most folks could in a lifetime. That winter, she planted seeds in jars on her windowsill. Come spring, she'd move them to soil. The earth had taken enough from her. Now maybe it was time to give something back. And me, I still sit on my porch some nights watching the wind cross the valley. Still think about the woman who came west with nothing but silence and stayed long enough to teach us what it really meant to be heard. Some folks fight with noise, some with fists, but the strongest ones, they fight with roots. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply not leave. In a world that asks us to speak louder, fight harder, and never stop moving, there's a kind of strength in choosing stillness, in showing up every day, planting something, fixing the thing that's broken, and holding your ground not with rage, but with grace. Clara didn't need to raise her voice. She let the wind carry her truth, and in the end, that truth settled into every porch, every child she healed, every piece of ground she defended. If this story touched something quiet in you, something you've carried too long, or something you thought had gone unnoticed, leave a comment. Let it out, let it root. And if you believe there are still stories like Clara's worth telling, subscribe to Still Winds of the West. We're still out here, listening, and when the wind changes, we'll be ready to tell the next one. Thank you for riding with us.